I want to talk about the first book of Maccabees. That means 16 chapters full of fighting for the freedom of Israel and for the freedom of religion against foreign oppression. So for Catholics it's part of the Bible, for Greek Orthodox it's part of the Bible, and it's a little bit part of the Bible for the Lutherans and Protestants as well, but not in the same sense as for the other Christian traditions, and it's not part of the Jewish Bible, although within the Jewish world the Maccabees are very famous. And this brings us already to this question, who are the Maccabees, who gave this book the name? And actually there's not just one book of Maccabees, but four, and in some part of Christian Bibles you have all four books of the Maccabees, and some you have only the first two.
1 Maccabees, so the first book of Maccabees.
The Maccabees, who are these Maccabees?
Maccabees represents these people, this family, who stood up against certain reforms that were going on, whereby people wanted to make Jerusalem more like the countries surrounding it.
And the name Maccabees is derived from the nickname of the most important figure of this family, called Judas, and he has a kind of nickname, and this was Maccabees. And it's not very completely clear what it means, but often it's interpreted as hammer. So Judas the Hammerer, so this is a kind of warrior name, Warhammer, you can call him. So Judas Warhammer, and he was the first leader in a fight against the foreign oppressors of the people of Israel in the 2nd century. And when we talk about the Maccabees and Judas Maccabeus, we are in the time of the 2nd century BCE, before Christ. And that means we are still living in a period where Israel is part of Eastern empires. So the power are still in the east. So the Assyrians first, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, all Eastern empires, and Israel is in a way on the border to the west. And now there is a dramatic change, in the beginning of 1st Maccabees mentioned this, because 1st Maccabees starts with Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great is the one who in a way moved the biblical world from east to west.
So Alexander the Great came through and brought what might be called Hellenization, Greekization, throughout this part of the world.
So he started in Macedonia, in nowadays Greece or Macedonia, and then conquered the whole east, including Israel, Egypt, and make his way via Afghanistan to the borders of India.
The big baddie in 1 Maccabees is Antiochus Epiphanes, and he is one of the later successors of Alexander the Great.
The book gives in the first chapter a kind of overview about the situation and describes how Jews who want to be faithful to their traditions and to their religion, that means to keep the Torah, that means the commandments given by God to Moses, who want to continue with circumcision and so on and keep the Jewish festivals, they were oppressed and persecuted, and for the first time Jews have to die for their religion. So you have the first martyrs for the Jewish religion.
In that situation, Antiochus Epiphanes did some things that were interpreted as being awful and a direct challenge to the God of Israel. So one of the things that he was interpreted as attacking is the temple.
He tried to force all inhabitants of Judea into this new pattern of religion. That means to follow a kind of pagan practice in religion.
1 Maccabees tells the story of these people who stood up to those reforms. It's the family of Mattathias. So Mattathias is the father, and then he's got a bunch of sons who stand up against Antiochus Epiphanes and what he represents.
And he sent his commissaires to all the villages that they had to do public offerings for the Greek gods. And this Mattathias, this father of 5 and a priest, and he refused. He killed these messengers of the Seleucid king, and then together with his sons and followers who want to be faithful to the traditional law, retreated into the desert and started a guerrilla warfare against the Seleucids.
Most of the time is spent talking about Judas. So Judas Maccabeus, you might have heard of. It's an interesting story. There are different Jewish responses to what Antiochus Epiphanes has done. Some people want to run away and hide, and they're presented as being, that's not the best option. The best option is to stay and fight for the Lord's law, the Torah, and the Lord's temple. One interesting turning point here happens relatively early on when the people decide, well, we're not going to fight on the Sabbath because that's our day of rest that the Lord has commanded in the Torah, so we're not going to fight on the Sabbath. When that happens, those people who've decided not to fight all get killed. And so those who are left see this and they decide, all right, that didn't work. We're allowed to fight on the Sabbath. And so that's an interesting turning point, I think, because they've come to the conclusion that in order to preserve the Torah, they have to disobey the Torah.
So the book of Maccabees was written around 100 BCE when the Hasmoneans, so the descendants of these Maccabees, were actually kings in Jerusalem. So they maintained a kingdom similar to the one of King David in the glorious past of Israel. And his idea is clearly expressed in the book that God has chosen this family to redeem his people. And so the book, First Maccabees, is more or less a book about 3 generations. So the father, these 5 brothers, and then the grandson of Mattathias, all are willing to give up their lives, all are willing to fight for the people of Israel. And so God has chosen them, and they are those who shall rule the Jewish people. So it's clearly propaganda in favor of this new dynasty.
An interesting thing about holy war is this idea that in order to obey God and to preserve God's honor, we have to slightly disobey him.
The Maccabees and the term Maccabee is quite omnipresent, so to speak, in the Israeli and Jewish society. If you are watching football in Israel, you will have Maccabi Haifa and Maccabi Tel Aviv, 2 famous teams playing in the first Israeli division. And their name Maccabi actually goes back to the Maccabees. And also the most famous beer in Israel is called the Maccabee beer.